And I think that there's room for that in a film, you know, because people will continue to talk about this. We're not the first and we're not the last. But with everything that's going on with Black Lives Matter and the conversations around anti-Blackness and Canada 150 and what that means for Indigenous folks, I think that there's so much that we could have explored more. And so that's one thing that's been on my mind in the last 2 years, is some of the things that we left out and didn't really dig deeper with.
No, fair enough. You know, it's interesting because I think that you mentioned a couple of sort of social movements that have taken place in those years since then. But what's interesting is how universal this story seems to be. It touches basically most countries in the world in some regard. And I wonder if you could just talk about, because you went to so many different places in this film, and I'm curious, did you learn anything? Were you surprised at the universality of the experiences that you saw when you went to each place?
I think working on the original documentary short, which came before this feature, I should go back to that point, because in 2009, when I had asked a number of women that I know, all friends, to be in the documentary, the short version, I think I emailed about 25 or 30 friends, and only like 5 got back to me. Actually, I should say 5 got back to me that were willing to, and then there was 2 others who responded but said, you know, I'm not ready to talk about this. And so it was around that time that I was starting to have conversations with people outside of my family or my community, being the Tamil community or the Sri Lankan community. And so in those conversations, that's kind of why I reached out to those women. That was when I first realized kind of the universality of it, and the connection between different communities across the world when it comes to this particular issue and the roots of it. So I was surprised, I would say, when I started. I think when we started to travel for the feature film, the thing that surprised me the most, which is amazing, is that, you know, being someone who's in diaspora, growing up in Toronto, you think that, or we start to assume that all the activism and progressive thinking is happening here, but actually I was really inspired by the conversations that I was seeing that were publicly happening. For example, in India, Miriam, who you meet, she's a women's rights activist, an activist across the board, and her and a group of folks actually like sued the company Fair and Lovely for their ads that are like, you know, that were placed in cities like Bombay or Mumbai and Delhi. So they were actually taking public action by taking legal action against some of these skin lightening companies and brands. And then what was happening at Hargeisa, in a community center, like young women having this very public conversation around skin bleaching and what's actually happening at that moment. And even in India, there is like, you know, there's campaigns that young women are running, especially in South India, to promote the beauty of dark skin, which isn't really happening here. So I was thoroughly surprised, and I'm really grateful to be reminded and checked that these movements are happening globally, and it's not just in the West, you know, I think.
Absolutely. In the film that we saw earlier that talked about the connection to our descendant, or our ancestors, and as well as our descendants, there was a question about what will the stories be told of future generations with respect to their own culture, identity, and experience. And I wonder if you have any thoughts in terms of, you know, here is this issue of shadeism, which goes back to colonialism and in all the various countries. And I'm wondering, did you see any signs of some of those norms and ideas changing? You mentioned a bit about some of the campaigns that are happening, but is there any sense as to how, you know, I guess your generation or even your niece is looking at that forward? Is there any change, or is it kind of just you know, cyclical in the circle?
Yeah, I think that there's change, because I mean, it's happening slowly a bit, but it's happening. When we did the film, some of the critiques we got, where there was, like, even when we were working with the story editor, is that there wasn't enough, like, sad stories or sappy, like, really like emotional stories. Like everyone seemed to be really confident and know what they're talking about, and that was a bad thing. And that was a purposeful choice for me, because I think that oftentimes when you see films or documentaries, particularly about Black, Indigenous, and other communities of color, is that it's like a woe is me, and it's oftentimes sad. And not to say that people are not experiencing difficult things, but we also have ownership over our stories. So I really wanted to show a group of women who are in my life in different capacities and how they've kind of worked through a lot of the issues. So I think when you see the film, working on the film and interviewing these women who I knew had these perspectives, but maybe didn't have full-fledged conversations up until the point of filming, that really started to show me how even us having these very real and honest conversations, and then like learning about some of the women in the film who also were having their own conversations with their mothers and their aunties and other elders in their life, as well as me with my mom and my elders. I think when I look at my niece, it's really difficult to say. So I didn't film her again for this feature, because so when we created the original short, I was naive in including her, and then it's gonna be hilarious. So she watches it, and then she will show people when they come to visit her at home this film. So she thinks she's famous because of the short film, which has been really difficult, because then she continues to perpetuate and say the things that get her the reactions that I think people show her, which is like, oh no, you're beautiful. Like by saying, oh, my skin's not white enough. She'll purposely say that now, and she also doesn't want to have the conversation. There's a big, I think, difference in, obviously, from what you see, she looks at me very differently. And so she's always like, oh, that's my aunt who like always is talking about shadism, and it's just like she rolls her eyes, and she's like 12 now, so she's like rolling her eyes all the time and doesn't want to have that conversation. So it's just interesting. It's gonna be interesting to see what happens next. But what I am inspired by, I should say, some of our best screenings are actually in schools. Our best screening today was at a school in Atlanta, and I remember there was a young woman there, and she was 14, a 9th grader, and they have so much access to information or starting points of information with Tumblr. That just keeps coming up, and Tumblr is a social media tool where people share other histories and information, and so they have so much access. And I was telling Dre, one of them, my friend Dre over there, I was telling her how that 14-year-old was like, some people think I'm militant about my beliefs, but I have access to Tumblr, and then it leads me to other research, and I know who I am, and I'm proud of who I am. And I was just sitting there with my producer, and I was like, I wish at 14 that I was that proud of my identity and my heritage. And so I really feel like when we're having these screenings in schools, that's really reminding me of the shifts that are happening, because I think that there is something to say about the access to information and the honesty and kinds of conversations that we're seeing with our high school screenings.
Well, that's great to know that is happening. Is that continuing? Are there still opportunities for
Yeah, we're working in the new year with the TDSB, and we work with the Peel District School Board. We also work with the National Association of Independent and Private Schools in the United States for charter schools and community schools. So we're trying to build, and a lot of our partners are universities and colleges as well, and then and different community-based organizations. So it's continuing.
That's amazing. A question I had was, in terms of the issue of shadism, is it something that you feel particularly targets women in these communities?
No, because I think it affects folks no matter how you identify, whether you identify as a man or woman, non-binary, whatever your ways of identifying or choosing not to identify. I think it affects everyone. I should say in relation to my family, my brother in particular my mom and dad and I are relatively the same skin tone. But my brother growing up was always darker, and folks on my dad's side of my family are darker skinned. They're from a different part of Sri Lanka. And so I remember when I was working on the feature after the short, he's like, how come you didn't interview me? Like, my experience is completely different from yours. And we did think about interviewing other folks for the film. I think the nature of also being an artist and a filmmaker and doing your first project is daunting. And so it already felt like a lot when we were, you know, at some point this was a mini series, and it was a doc, and it went back to mini, like we were just going back and forth in format. Like you see there's so many people, that's kind of because I got obsessed with filming. Like I wanted to try and capture everybody's experience. And so in that, like we stuck to